Welcome to another episode of the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. A progressive insight into Michigan's political and cultural world. And of course, an entertaining podcast designed to shine a light on how to make Michigan's political machine work for the people. Now, from the Left of Lansing headquarters, located in his attic, here's the award-winning Pat Johnston.
Oh, yeah! Welcome to another installment of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. I am the award-winning Pat Johnston, and did you see how the right-wing MAGA majority in the state of Ohio is putting the serious issues at the forefront this week? The serious issues for the people, I should say, at the forefront this week. According to WBNS TV 10 in Columbus, Republican State Representative Josh Williams says on social media he's introducing a bill to make flag planting in sports a felony in the state. His proposal comes after the November 30th fight at the Michigan-Ohio State rivalry football game when the Wolverines beat up on the Buckeyes 13-10 and then attempted to plant their flag at midfield. A fight ensued and police had to use pepper spray to disperse the players. Hey, I mean, they can vote out strong, working-class progressives like the great Senator Sherrod Brown, watch their state turn into an economic laughingstock, and attack women's reproductive rights on a daily basis, but damn it all to hell if they're going to sit there and watch another Michigan Wolverine team plant a flag at their 50-yard line of their beloved horseshoe after witnessing another loss to the maize and blue. They aren't going to let those kinds of shenanigans happen again on their turf, not in Ohio. Of course, they could just try, beating Michigan for once, but at least they're making laws to limit and restrict the ways Michigan can freely celebrate. Hey, go figure. A Republican politician writing bills designed to restrict the freedoms of others. By the way, visit me on Blue Sky. I'm there, and that's where I'm doing the majority of my commentaries during the week. And don't forget to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the show on YouTube. And if you'd ever like to reach me for a little dialogue, the best way to do that is leftoflansing@gmail.com. Coming up here in a few moments, David Dayen, Executive Director of the American Prospect and host of the podcast called Organized Money, will be my guest this week. Last week, I shared David's piece in the American Prospect titled Michigan Democrats Deliver Lame Duck Disappointment. The first Democratic trifecta in 40 years is ending with internal dissent, stalled legislation, and up to $10 billion in corporate subsidies. And in that story, David illustrates the frustrations many progressive State House Democrats and activists are having over the Democratic leadership's decision during the lame duck session to prioritize more corporate subsidies for the corporate donor base rather than prioritizing a number of bills that could help millions of Michiganders in the future with affordable housing, driver's licenses for migrant workers, polluter pay to ensure companies clean up their polluted messes, a homeless bill of rights, government transparency, a bill that would limit political contributions from utilities like DTE. Those bills are just sitting in the legislature and are barely moving. That's what is so wrong right now with Lansing, and the Democratic leadership in Lansing is letting that happen. Mr. Dayen also shows how some of those corporate subsidy bills also allow companies like Google and Meta data centers to skirt environmental laws and much, much more. So the American Prospect's David Dayen will join me here in just a few moments. Recently, our good friends from Progress Michigan unveiled some striking poll numbers from public policy polling showing which issues Michiganders believe to be the most important. In Progress Michigan's monthly research newsletter called Lake Effect, the numbers are showing which issues Michigan's Democratic leadership in the state legislature should probably take into account in these final days of the lame duck session. Now, let me remind you, in case you need reminding, Democrats lost the House majority in the state house in last month's election. So that means they've got just a few legislative days remaining where they have the majority and they must get some important progressive bills across the finish line before the MAGA Republicans take over the House gavel on January first. They've got to get moving. Now, let me read what Progress Michigan reports from that public policy polling because it is striking. It says 81% support implementing paid family leave. 66% support passing an income-based water affordability program. 92% support requiring corporations to clean up their own pollution. 92% support opening the governor's office and legislature to FOIA requests. 69% support closing the dark store tax loophole. 61% support protecting access to contraception, comprehensive and accurate sex education in schools, and reproductive freedom. 66% support addressing the Black maternal mortality rate. 68% support the Michigan Voting Rights Act. And 64% support protecting Michigan's paid sick leave implementation, minimum wage increases, and the gradual elimination of tipped minimum wage. That's pretty striking right there. Those numbers should be posted everywhere around the Michigan legislature. So let's go through some of these, shall we? First, 81% support implementing paid family leave. So I've talked about these bills with mothering Justices Daniel Atkinson here on the show, but there's a bit of a development here. According to Michigan Advance's Kyle Davidson and Anna Liz Nichols, Democratic State Senator Erica Geis of Taylor testified on her Senate bills recently, which would allow employees to take up to 12 weeks of paid leave for circumstances, including maternity leave, paternity leave, caring for oneself or a family member facing long-term illness, and caring for oneself or a family member who has faced sexual assault, domestic violence, or other types of interpersonal or community violence. So these bills were voted out of a Senate committee finally, and this would be a huge boon for Michigan workers, but guess what? Also for Michigan's businesses. Because as Luke Schaefer, faculty director for poverty solutions at the University of Michigan and good friend of the podcast, told Michigan Advance, a recent Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity study showed how other states fared with solid family leave bills, and Schaefer said that the evidence leads them to conclude that paid paternal leave, caregiving leave, and medical leave have demonstrated positive economic impacts and positive health impacts for employees and their families. And here's what Schaefer said. Studies find that paid paternal leave can support better postpartum recovery for moms, which is not only beneficial to their well-being, but also contributes to longer-run improved family financial health. These policies, Schaefer says, also supports a healthy start in life for babies and thus are an important investment in the next generation. Now, Senator Geis's bills would be funded through payroll contributions from employers and employees, with employers permitted to deduct up to 50% of the required contribution from their employees' wages, with the employer contributing the remainder. However, Geis noted in her testimony that businesses with fewer than 25 employees would be exempt from contribution requirements, though their employees could still contribute and gain access to the program. Union-negotiated paid family bills would not be subject to change either. Now, of course, the right-wing Michigan Chamber of Commerce is steadfast against the bill, which is striking considering how a bill like this would help workers and thereby help the businesses where they work. I mean, come on. It's common sense. That's gotta pass before more corporate handouts that the Michigan Chamber of Commerce just loves. A healthy workforce, by the way, is kind of important, is it not? Okay, back to the poll showing that a stunning 92% of Michiganders support polluter pay, which requires corporations to clean up their own polluted messes. Polluter pay has been sitting in the state legislature forever, and it is a popular plan. If you're Governor Whitmer, why aren't you out there demanding Democrats and Republicans to bring a bill to her desk that has 92% support? The same goes for opening up the governor's office and legislature's records to FOIA requests. I mean, Michigan's government is one of the least transparent governments in the union. It's time to do the right thing. This is what the people want. Governor Whitmer and the Democrats should be going to the press each and every day talking about why we must make Michigan the most transparent state, which protects the people's interests over the corporate interests. Back to the poll. 66% support passing an income-based water affordability program. Progressive Democratic State Senator Stephanie Chang, and also friend of this podcast, has a water affordability bill already in the legislature. As Michigan Advance's Kyle Davidson reports, Chang's bill would create a statewide water affordability program and prevent water shutoffs. Despite receiving a hearing in 2023, the bills have yet to come to a vote in committee. If passed, the bills would cap water bills at 2% of the average annual household income in a water provider service area for households at up to 135% of the federal poverty level. For households in between 135 and 200% of the federal poverty level, bills would be capped at 3% of the average household income in that area. Senator Chang noted that the legislation would now allow individuals within 200% and 250% of the federal poverty level experiencing an emergency situation such as a job loss or medical bill placing them into financial hardship to apply to participate in the program temporarily, provided that they can demonstrate that extreme hardship. Look, I think we could all agree, nobody should go without water. I mean, come on. This is a no-brainer, but we'd rather focus on giving Google millions of dollars for data centers that swallow huge amounts of water. Come on, Democrats, pass the water affordability program. Now, here's one not getting much attention, but it affects all of our local libraries and schools. 69% support in that public policy polling, 69% support closing the dark store tax loophole. Now, this dark store tax loophole allows big store retailers to skirt paying local taxes that are needed to help fund public libraries and public schools across the state. Also, Michigan Democrats must pass bills that would allow all Michiganders access to driver's licenses regardless of their immigration status. This allows undocumented immigrants to get to their work in which, would help them pay taxes that benefits all of us here in the state. We have to value all our workers, and we used to give undocumented workers driver's licenses in Michigan until 2008, but that ended thanks to that idiot Republican Attorney General Mike Cox. And by the way, where is he nowadays? There's so much good that Democrats could do in this lame duck session. And if there's something that we can learn from this past election, it's that the people feel like our government cares more about the rich, more about the elites, and more about the untouchables rather than caring about the people. Yes, I'm just as baffled as you are as to why they think that the Donald Trump family is just what we need to stop that kind of corruption. However, we do have to admit to ourselves that Democrats lost their way, not just here in Michigan, but basically everywhere, as the party courted corporate acceptance and corporate approval rather than the workers' approval. If there's something good that could come out of this hideous election, it's that Michigan Democrats learn that lesson and are listening to the people. And by listening to the people, they could pass bills designed to help people and not corporations. Coming up to talk more about the corporate influence in Lansing is the American Prospect's David Dayen. He's my guest this week on Michigan's premier progressive podcast. You're listening to LOL.
He spent nearly 25 years working as a liberal voice in conservative talk radio across the state, and he's still a somewhat stable person. It's the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. You can find archives of the podcast, plus Pat's musings on other topics in written form at leftoflansing.com. Left of Lansing archives are available wherever you get your podcasts. And now Left of Lansing is available on YouTube. We'd like to thank Audio Boom for distributing all our episodes so we can share progressive, otherwise known as common sense, values across Michigan and the country. Now, here's Pat Johnston.
I'd just like to send some thank yous out first before we move on here. One, I'd like to thank my wife and the technical advisor to Left of Lansing, Dr. Heather, for all of her efforts on getting everything off the ground and getting the studio up and ready. So, Dr. Heather, thank you so much. I'd like to thank my good friend Jessica for all of her work on being such an awesome show voice. I told Jess that she should be expecting some new liners during the holidays, so Jess, get that voice ready. Thanks to my good friend Rich for all of his hard work on getting leftoflansing.com up and running efficiently. And another thank you to my good friend Kirsten for producing that remarkable Left of Lansing logo. You see, everyone, this is a solo project. I didn't really get any backing. I don't have any corporate money behind all of this. This was just my own thing, and it would have never have gotten off the ground without the help of some really, really good people out there. And of course, thanks to all of you who listen to this podcast week in and week out. Okay, so last week I shared with you an article by the American Prospect's David Dayen titled Michigan Democrats Deliver Lame Duck Disappointment. The first Democratic trifecta in 40 years is ending with internal dissent, stalled legislation, and up to $10 billion in corporate subsidies. And in that article, David explains how Michigan's Democratic leadership in the state legislature is choosing to prioritize corporate-backed bills like additional failed corporate subsidies and the watering down of paid family leave and higher minimum wage bills to satisfy the powerful restaurant lobby, for instance, rather than passing a slew of bills that have been languishing in the legislature for some time now. The article also tells the story of frustrated progressive Democrats inside Lansing who are incensed by the lack of awareness from establishment Democrats after the party just lost its state trifecta after just 2 years in power. And with just days remaining in the lame duck session with Democrats in complete power, the clock is ticking for Democrats to produce bills that'll help the people rather than pleasing their corporate donor base because, as progressive Democratic State Representative Betsy Kofia said recently, red team or blue team, big corporations run Michigan. Everyone, that has to change. Joining me to talk about what he learned talking with Michigan Democrats in that story is David Dayen, Executive Director of the American Prospect. David, thanks so much for coming on this week.
Thank you for having me.
Well, what made you, want to focus on what is, or more importantly, maybe what isn't happening inside the Michigan legislature during this lame duck period?
Sure. Well, 2 states lost their Democratic trifectas in the 2024 elections. There was Minnesota and Michigan. Minnesota hasn't called a lame duck session, so they don't actually have anything going on right now. And after I started talking to some folks in Michigan, I'm wondering whether that would have been the better solution. So obviously, we're a national organization. We're looking at what the states are doing to move things forward now that we have a looming Trump administration at the federal level. A lot of states have talked about, blue states have talked about, what they're going to do in terms of Trump-proofing their states, protecting the vulnerable, helping maximize whatever legislative action that they can in the time that they have left. And so it was surprising to me to talk to these folks in Michigan and hear that actually what's being prioritized, as you mentioned, are a bunch of economic development subsidies, corporate subsidies to some of the largest corporations in America, while other legislation that would speak to many of the issues in the election and in the post-election period are just sitting there languishing. So I thought it was an interesting story to elevate to our readers.
You mentioned how you were looking at both Minnesota and Michigan. You said Minnesota does not have a lame duck session. Is that correct? They don't do anything right now?
Well, they're not currently. The governor, Tim Walz, the vice presidential candidate, has the ability to call a special session, but he has not done so at this point. So it's not built in to their legislative structure that there's a post-election session, unlike in Michigan.
Just wondering, just from people that you've talked to and the numbers that you saw, did you find any similarities between Michigan and Minnesota and why Democrats lost their majorities?
Well, I really focused on Michigan in this piece.
Okay.
What I can tell you is that in Minnesota, they had a very thin majority, much like in Michigan, in the 2023-2024 legislative session. Only 1 vote in the state Senate and just a handful of votes in the state House. The 2024 elections had a slight tilt towards Republicans, and that's all it really took, right? That was enough to move things in the direction of Republicans in those handful of seats where they could regain a majority in one chamber of the legislature. I believe it is the state House in Minnesota that flipped, similar to what happened in Michigan.
In your article, you talked to a handful of progressive Democrats like Dylan Wagella and Emily Devendorf, and it seems like they told you, as they've echoed here with me for the last few years as well, how corporate interests get the best seats here at the table, regardless, though, of the party. That's always been kind of my experience, too. Even this was happening when Republicans were in power, too. But at least initially, Democrats did get some progressive bills through the legislature once they gained full power, which you did describe. So did you get any clues from your reporting and from the people you talked with as to why that suddenly just got bogged down for the most part and why everything just kind of switched over to paying attention to corporate interests?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there was this pent up legislative action after 40 years of not having full power in Lansing. And so that made some of the decisions rather easy. It was the low-hanging fruit, whether it was getting rid of anti-union right-to-work law, repealing the 1931 abortion law, doing some other protections for the LGBT community, and expanding the earned income tax credit. A lot of these were things that had been talked about on the campaign trail, things that had been talked about for a long time in Michigan. Once that low-hanging fruit was done, and there was also the energy package that was worked on pretty extensively. But once that was done, I feel like there was kind of a rudderless ship, that there wasn't a lot of attention paid to individual legislators and their interests and their bills, and more about just sort of this overall, what can we do to attract corporations and allegedly bring jobs? And that seemed to take over after that burst of legislative action. It's kind of easier when the legislative pieces are very well defined in the early, first 100 days. After that, you get a little more of listening to the lobbyists rather than the people who sent these representatives to Lansing.
I've interviewed a gentleman. His name is Rick Hagelin. He's what he calls a Michi economist for Michigan Advance. And we talked about some of those lavish subsidies that Ford, GM, Google, and others have gotten. And when I asked him about the futility of, corporate subsidies and how they really do seem to pitch, one state against another in this continuous battle to the bottom, he quite frankly said, while that may be true, that's the only way states are doing business right now. That doesn't exactly point to a brighter future for, I guess, any state, including my state. I mean, does it? It doesn't really to me. I don't know.
I've been covering these corporate subsidy deals for a long time, and that's kind of the conventional wisdom. What are you going to do? There are a finite number of businesses. They have a lot of opportunities to locate their headquarters, their large job centers, and states are in a battle among one another to attract those businesses. But inherent in that is the assumption that the only way you can do that is by buying them off, by spending money. As I mentioned in the piece, Michigan is poised to spend, if some of the final pieces come together in the lame duck session, $10 billion on corporate subsidies in the last 2 years. That's $1,000 for every man, woman, and child in the state of Michigan. So you ask, where could that $10 billion be otherwise placed in a way that would also attract businesses while improving the lives of Michiganders? And you could say, what if that money goes towards an educated workforce that businesses are always looking for? What if it goes towards improved infrastructure, which is something businesses look at in terms of where they're going to locate their job centers? What if it goes towards purification of the environment so that workers in those particular businesses that you're trying to attract know that they can have healthy, clean air and clean water? There are a host of ways that you can attract businesses, and it doesn't always come down to what is euphemistically described as a business-friendly climate, but what is really a payoff in terms of tax breaks or subsidies or grants or things of that nature. There are a whole host of other ways to get a business into your state or into your city, and it's been proven over time. You look at places like Oklahoma City, which basically Ford said, we're forswearing all of these economic development subsidies. We're just going to make this a great place to do business. And it worked. Another one is Minnesota. We mentioned them before. Minnesota has one of the highest levels in terms of a business-friendly climate. And yet they also have the highest tax rate, corporate tax rate in the entire country. And that anomaly is easily solved when you realize that there's really good education in Minnesota. There's really good climate measures. There's really good infrastructure, and businesses want to be there. So this whole idea that we have to pay off businesses to get them to locate their factories here is really an old way of thinking that needs to be updated.
And I think the part that gets a lot of people, and probably both Democrats, Republicans, independents in Michigan, and I'm going to guess probably elsewhere across the country as well, is that you have state governments just throwing all this cash, bribes, whatever you want to call them, towards these corporations with very little, if or probably zero safeguards on them to guarantee that, hey, if we give you this money, you have to do this, you have to do ABC, because most of the time that's not really what happens. And I believe that's why so many people are angry with how the current system is working, or actually not working for them.
Yeah, there's not a ton of oversight that goes on. A good example in Michigan is the bill that passed during the lame duck session, at least on the House side, and that is the data center bill that offers any data center with at least $250 million in capital investment will be eligible for an exemption from sales and use taxes on equipment going out, I believe, to 2050. And this would go towards companies like Microsoft, companies like Google, companies like Meta, who are doing AI and need the computing power at these data centers. But we know that these kinds of facilities create very few, if not zero, jobs. And so then the question becomes, well, why are you giving this money out? Could be as much as $90 million, I believe, over the 25-year period. And you're not, first of all, building in really full safeguards for the tremendous amount of energy use and water use that these data centers take up. But also, you're just giving this money away without any guarantee that there'll be more than a handful of jobs created. And the question is, what is the return on investment for the state of Michigan? There's even the fact that the reason that the water is used so much in these data centers is because of the cooling systems. And most of these data centers use a cooling system that involves evaporating that water. If they merely switch to a closed loop kind of recirculation of water to use that as their cooling system, they would use vastly smaller amounts of water. And yet that was not built in as a condition for accepting these subsidies. As one individual who's involved in clean water in Michigan told me, these companies are basically saying, you have to give us money and we're not going to spend more than the bare minimum to protect water in the Great Lakes region. It is a bit mind-boggling that you would throw that kind of money at that particular kind of facility, which has very little job accumulation.
David, I know that you already mentioned them, but can you just repeat one more time which companies stand to benefit greatly from this data center bill package?
Yeah, you're probably talking about Microsoft. You're talking about Google. You're talking about Meta. You're talking about OpenAI, maybe. These are some of the largest and most powerful companies in America. They can certainly afford to build a data center anywhere they want. Some of these are trillion-dollar companies. And the idea that they have to get a tax break on sales and use taxes because they're essentially sticking up the rest of the country and saying, give me your best offer, and only then will I deign to give these data centers over. It's really hard to understand unless you think about the role that money plays in politics, that it's maybe not so much about attracting these data centers and getting the meager amount of jobs out of them, but it's about making Google, Meta, Microsoft, big spenders in elections, very happy and reaping the benefits of that in your various campaign accounts.
You've already described how a bill like this would lead to environmental havoc. And this is happening right after Democrats and Gretchen Whitmer, the governor, celebrated this clean energy package that they passed a year ago, which, for the most part, there were some issues with that bill. I looked at it as some decent steps forward compared to, Republicans were in charge a few years ago. Nothing ever happened on that. But that being said, this sort of gives a mixed message, though, doesn't it? That, hey, we passed this renewable energy a year ago, but hey, now we need these data centers.
It actually specifically gives some of the biggest utilities in Michigan an out under that bill that was passed last year. If energy demand exceeds the existing supply, then power plants that are powered by fossil fuels that were supposed to be phased out under the bill could actually stay online. And so one of the biggest supporters of this data center bill was DTE Energy, which joined these big tech firms in lobbying in favor of it. The CEO of DTE, Jerry Norcia, is currently the president of the American Gas Association. So he wants to keep those gas plants online, those fossil fuel facilities online, and bringing a bunch of data centers into Michigan that increases the demand for energy is a means to help him do that. So DTE was on the front lines of this. They were telling their own investors what was happening with the bills, whether or not Governor Whitmer would sign them, whether or not House Democrats would end up supporting them. And so DTE was a huge behind-the-scenes player in this.
You mentioned in your story, too, about Democratic Representative Dylan Wagela getting in a little bit of trouble with the Democratic leadership for something he said about DTE. Can you talk about that?
Right. So apparently Wagela was going to send a constituent letter that was going to mention DTE. It was going to say, instead of the government holding DTE accountable, your energy rates rise. And you feel it when infrastructure projects take too long or needs are neglected because money has been given as tax breaks and cash payments to multi-billion-dollar corporations. All of that part of the letter was essentially censored by the caucus leadership. He was blocked from sending those portions that criticized these kind of corporate subsidy deals and also criticized DTE Energy. So it's a telling sign of kind of who runs Lansing, right? This is an elected official who is not allowed to make certain kinds of speech in a letter to his own constituents. That's a pretty shocking development.
Yes, it is, David. And I can tell you, many Michiganders, regardless of their political leanings, DTE does not have a whole lot of love from really anybody. So I don't know why. I don't know why the Democratic leadership would really be, trying to protect them.
With the exception of those who have campaign accounts that get filled by, DTE PACs and executives and things like that. Yeah, basically what it came down to when whether it was advocates or elected officials, they told me that money essentially runs Lansing. And the reason for these priorities and the reason that the bills that aren't being prioritized are sitting around, things that would reduce the cost of housing or create a bill forcing polluters to pay for their own cleanup or the driver's license bill, a host of different things, which I'm sure you've talked about on the show. The reason those are sitting around is that vulnerable people don't have good lobbyists. And the corporations who want to get to the front of the line, they do.
My last question for you here is, before I get to it, I just have to say that I think maybe the part that makes me bang my head against my desk is how this push for corporate subsidies by Michigan Democrats has really left the door wide open for state Republicans to scream about how Democrats only care about corporate interests and not your interests. And I think it would make you laugh too, because I can't believe that's happening, considering how during most of my life, say your life, that Republicans were always the party of big corporations and deregulations for their donor base, and the party that always fought for the corporate tax cuts, and on and on and on. And you described how incoming House Speaker Matt Hall is saying that, maybe the money being diverted to corporations should be used to fund road repairs, which makes sense to many Michiganders, considering that we've got some of the worst roads here in the nation. But what astonishes me is that the Democratic leadership is allowing this clown, and he is a clown. This Matt Hall is a clown, but they're allowing him to run to their left flank by painting Democrats as the party of corporations. And I guess maybe I feel that this is, in a way, a microcosm of what is happening with the Democratic Party across the nation. And it kind of helps explain a little bit, to some extent, of what happened in this election. I don't know. What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's really quite something to see that statement from the speaker-elect there in Michigan and allowing this sort of outflanking to go on. As Dylan Wagela said to me, I thought that was something Democrats should be saying, that we should use money on road repairs rather than giving Dan Gilbert and GM a bunch of money to, overhaul the Renaissance Center in Detroit. I do think that there's a national resonance here, not least of which because Gretchen Whitmer is obviously someone who has been whispered about as a potential presidential candidate. And it's important to see what her priorities are right at the last moments when she has, the Democrats have power in Michigan. But also, kind of as you were saying, as Democrats get cozier and cozier with these kinds of interests, and we saw this in the presidential campaign where Kamala Harris's brother-in-law was the head legal officer at Uber. We've seen this down the line, and it does tend to alienate people who, are longtime Democrats who believe, or at least thought, that the party was one of the two parties in America that's the actual party of the people. It eats away at that brand. it eats away at the statements that Democrats make on the stump, and it breeds distrust. And if it's happening that way in Michigan, a swing state, that's a big deal for the rest of the country. So I think you're onto something, that these kinds of corporate giveaways are something that Democrats should really think pretty hard about, because their kind of purpose as a party is, at least historically, has been to try to stop this kind of nonsense.
David Dayen, executive editor of the American Prospect. David, people can check out all your articles there. And do you have any other things that people should look out for when it comes to your work?
We have podcasts. I do a podcast called Organized Money, which is about money and power and politics. That's at organizedmoney.fm. So, we're out there just every day grinding, trying to get information about ideas, politics, and power, who has power, what they're doing with it, and how it matters to you.
A podcast that believes in using common sense to move Michigan into the future. And by common sense, we mean progressive sense. We've all seen what 40 years of Republican leadership did to this state, and we refuse to go back. It's Left of Lansing with Pat Johnston. You can follow Pat on Facebook or X. Pat still calls it Twitter. Or on the Gram, Threads, and also on YouTube. Subscribe to the show on YouTube and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. All right, I think we gave Pat enough time to catch his breath. Let's get back to it. Here's Pat Johnston.
Thanks again to David Dayen for talking with us again this week. It was a privilege and an honor to have him appear. And I will once again provide links to his American Prospect story and also to his podcast called Organized Money. Time now for the Left of Lansing Last Call. So, because I like to keep it real, I'm going to give Michigan Democrats some praise for doing something good here this week. This is great news, and the best part is that it's soon to become law once it hits Governor Gretchen Whitmer's desk. Anna Liz Nichols from Michigan Advance reports that State House Democrats passed bills this week to expand Michigan's eligibility for unemployment benefits from 20 to 26 weeks and to steeply increase maximum payments, though the bills that cleared the State House on Tuesday passed with strong opposition from Republicans. Whoa, wait, hold up a second. I thought Michigan Republicans were the party of the everyday people, the working people. You mean to tell me you thought MAGA Republicans could really shed their pure disdain for the working class? Come on. The Michigan Advance story notes, currently the max weekly benefit a person can collect on unemployment in Michigan is a measly $362, with this bill seeking to bump that maximum up to $614 over a 3-year span. For all the talk about how inflation was real and is a real hindrance affecting real people, and it really is, you'd think Republicans would join Democrats in passing this bump in unemployment insurance to the people. But then again, these are the Republicans. They never have any solutions, ever. You want proof? Listen to what Republican State Representative William Bruck, who owns a home healthcare business, had to say when he explained why he hates working class people so much who need assistance from time to time. And I quote, "I'm not against individuals making or getting more money, but when it comes to the unemployment is not meant to be a living wage. It is not to be an amount that someone can function on and not have to worry about getting another job." How the hell is $614 considered a living wage in today's time, Representative Bruck? I mean, how the hell is $300 considered a living wage? And that's just what Detroit Democratic House Representative Tyrone Carter retorted as he said, "To think that someone would walk away from a job to live in poverty is insulting to them." Yes, it is. Oh, and here's another part of the bill that Democrats should be praised for. Domestic violence victims could receive benefits if they voluntarily quit their jobs so that way they can protect themselves and others. For all their bluster about protecting girls and protecting women, once again, Michigan Republicans show their true colors. They're all for forcing women to stay in a quasi-prison with their abusive domestic partners rather than helping them find a way out. It's the Christian nationalistic part of the MAGA Republicanism where, no matter what, they really do believe this, man has domain over woman. Meanwhile, the UAW celebrated passage of this bill, which again is headed to Governor Whitmer's desk. And the UAW said in part, Michigan's unemployment system has been one of the most restrictive in the nation, leaving too many workers behind during times of economic hardship. This reform begins to address these inequities, but much more needs to be done to ensure all workers are treated fairly and with dignity. You see, this is how Michigan Democrats can show that they really are the party of the people. Pass more bills like this and stop with the mixed messaging of satisfying corporate lobbyists. This is how you win over people in the long run.
You're listening to the Left of Lansing podcast. The music you're hearing is by Wanderbeats. To hear the latest project, check out Space Leopard on your favorite streaming site. Now back to our favorite progressive voice in Michigan. It's Pat Johnston.
Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Left of Lansing. Special thanks again to the American Prospect's David Dayen, and next week's show will be the final one for 2024, as I will take Christmas and New Year's weeks off, but I will still provide a Friday short on January 3rd, as I'll try to get back into the swing of things by then, and then I'll be back with another weekly episode on January 9th. And you know what? I just thought about this. It's hard to believe, but we'll know where the Detroit Lions will be in playoff seeding by that time. Remember, my email is leftoflansing@gmail.com, and don't forget to follow me on Blue Sky. Until next week, remember, take the battle to them. Thank you, Michigan.
The Left of Lansing podcast was produced by Pat Johnston, written by Pat Johnston, researched by Pat Johnston, edited by Pat Johnston, and hosted by, yes, Pat Johnston. Technical assistance by Dr. Heather. And thanks to our good friend Kirsten for the awesome podcast logo. Remember to visit leftoflansing.com for more news and information. Thanks again for listening to the Left of Lansing podcast.